Today we're going to talk about independent versus dependent variables. And so independent and dependent variables are what we use along the axis on a coordinate plane. So there's actually a rhyme or reason to which one goes on the x-axis and which one goes on the y-axis. So we're going to talk about that today. So one of those is the independent and the other is the dependent. So the independent variable is the amount that's being changed somehow. And the dependent variable, that one always depends, that's how I remember it, on the independent. So there's a little phrase I use to help me remember which one goes with which. So I always say the dependent depends on the independent. And then I will plug my two situations in here to see which one makes sense. So the independent variable or axis that's always the independent variable is your x-axis. And the dependent is always the y. So I even put the little y and the little x in here just so I can remember. So let's look at our first situation here. So the more gallons of milk I have, the more cups of milk I can pour. So I first need to determine what I'm comparing. Sometimes that'll be given to you, but in this case, it's not. So here I'm comparing the gallons of milk that I have and the cups of milk that I can pour. All right, so my two things I'm comparing are my gallons and my cups. So I plug in those two situations up here and see what makes sense. So do the gallons of milk that I have depend on the cups of milk that I can pour, or do the cups of milk that I can pour depend on the gallons of milk that I have? Well, the cups depend on the gallons because otherwise it doesn't make sense. My gallons don't depend on my cups. My gallons just are. So the more gallons that I have, the more cups I can pour. So my gallons of milk is my independent. And remember, that's my x. And then my dependent variable is my cups of milk. So always stick them in and see which one depends on the other one. In this case, the cups I can pour depend on the gallons. So we'll title our graph here, cups of milk per gallon. And I have a graph and I have a ratio table. So we said up here, my independent variable, my x is my gallons of milk. So remember, this is the x-axis. So this will be my gallons of milk. And then this is my y-axis. So that's going to be my cups of milk. So now I'm going to look at my ratio table. I'm going to fill in a couple here for us. And I'm going to look at the relationship of the ratio that I'm given in the table. So what's happening to this 3 to get to x, or to get to y rather? I'm multiplying by 2. So I would do the same thing here. I would do x times 2 is 2. 4 times 2 is 8. 13 times 2, just for a larger number, would be 26. I'm not going to be able to graph this one. It won't fit on my graph, but that's okay. I have enough other points to graph that it should work just fine. So now I'm going to place those on my graph just like they were ordered pairs. So 1, 2, so over 1, up 2. 3, 6, over 3, up 6. 4, 8, so over 4, up 8. And like I said, that 13, I can get the x-axis, but I can't get up to 26 on the y, so I'll leave that. My point should make a straight line if I've done everything correctly. And they do. So now the final piece of this is that I need to write an equation for this graph and for my table. So I always go back to my table to write my equation. That's always the easiest for me. And so I look at what was happening here. Well, I was multiplying by 2 in this table. So here, 1 times 2 equals 2, 3 times 2 equals 6, 4 times 2 equals 8. So I look to see what my variables are up in my table. So I'm really doing x times 2 equals, because these all equal this, equals y. So that's my equation. My equation comes directly from my table. So it's x times 2 equals y, or I can say 2x equals y. I could say y equals 2x. And if you want to double check, plug some of your numbers back in here and see if it makes sense. So for instance, if I stick, for my x value, if I stick 13 in, 13 times 2 is 26, and that's my y value. So I know that equation is correct. And so that's how you determine independent and dependent variables and write equations.